Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. You students of the First Battle of Manassas, or Bull Run if you prefer, are well aware of the consensus opinion shared by historians that both sides were too disorganized and exhausted by victory to do much of anything. The Confederates too tired out to pursue the inexperienced Union troops that panicked and skedaddled all the way back to the safety of Washington's defenses. As you might imagine, the reasons are more nuanced. One of the Confederacy's respected and thoughtful brigadier generals, he's pictured here, is Maryland's Bradley Tyre Johnson. His life dates 1829 to 1903. He tells us as much in his 1891 biography of his friend, General Joseph E. Johnston, who, along with fellow General Pierre G.T. Beauregard, won the battle on July 21st, 1861. Johnson dedicates an entire chapter in that biography, and the name of the chapter is The Consequences of Victory, to assess how the commanders on both sides were inexperienced themselves in leading such large numbers of men. It's about 36,000 Union soldiers and between 32 and 34,000 Confederates by one estimate. Their underestimation or overestimation of the fighting capabilities of those volunteers and inabilities in support and logistics led to missed opportunities. Johnson goes on to discuss why the South lost the war based upon what he learned at the battle or from the battle of First Manassas and events that followed. I want to read the chapter to you in his own words as he shares these critical observations 3 decades after the end of the battle. So here we begin the chapter 6, The Consequences of the Victory. Johnson writes, "It must be borne in mind that no man on either side had ever seen so many men in battle before. Scott, that's Winfield Scott's army of occupation of 8,000 in Mexico, had been the largest number that any of them had ever served with. Johnston had never seen such volunteers march or fight before, and his observation of their marching power on the route from Winchester to Piedmont, this is coming towards Manassas, had convinced him that they were utterly incapable, yet a while of accomplishing anything with their legs. President Davis, Jefferson Davis, on the contrary, had not seen the army of the Shenandoah on the march, but he had seen the 1st Mississippi Regiment with him as colonel march and fight at Monterey and Buena Vista during the war with Mexico. While the one underestimated, the other exaggerated the value of the American volunteer. It was not until after the 7 days battles that the docility, the intelligence, and the endurance of the Southern volunteer was appreciated by General Lee. I do not believe that any Union general in chief but McClellan and Grant ever fully understood the value of the Northern volunteer. The fact that General Johnston did not occupy Washington in the first few days after the rout at Manassas, force recognition by the foreign powers, and achieve independence for the South has been greatly complained of among the Confederates and criticized in the North and by a foreign writer, he adds. President Davis has left on record his opinion that Johnston ought to have taken Washington and that if he had acted on his advice, he would have done so. The Count of Paris thinks that while he could not have taken Washington, Johnston ought to have sent a few brigades across the Potomac to worry and harass the enemy. General Johnston himself was satisfied of the wisdom of his course and never changed his opinion. The light which time and experience throws over events and situations gives us clearer views that the actors themselves had. General Johnston was of the opinion that his army, exhausted by the combat and the marching of Sunday the 21st, without wagons, rations, cooking utensils, or shoes, could not have marched the 30 miles from the Stone Bridge to the fortifications of Arlington and carried them, nor have crossed the navigable Potomac dominated by war vessels. But Johnston did not know, for at that time no one could know, the enormous force of morale in men, the prodigious power of enthusiasm. When armies meet in death struggle, the one overcomes the other. The courage, the enthusiasm, the high spirits, the morale, which the beaten army loses, is attracted to and absorbed by the victorious army. The pursuit is always more capable of supreme effort than the retreat. The victor is stronger, more enduring, more spirited than the vanquished. He can march farther, fight harder, eat less, sleep less, work more than his successful opponent. Jackson was the first man on either side who discovered the fact and had a full appreciation of it. On the night of July 21st, no one had any idea of the extent of the Federal rout. It rained all night after the battle, and at daylight of the 22nd, Colonel Jeb Stuart was sent with the 1st Virginia Cavalry and Elzey's brigade to Fairfax Courthouse. On that march, the symptoms of disorder were so remarkable that Stuart refused to believe the evidence of his own eyes. He suspected that a ruse was being used and a trap being laid. The road was filled with debris, perfect muskets, accoutrements, uniforms, sutlers' wagons, handsome carriages filled with the choicest delicacies for a fete champêtre. In one place, a soldier picked up 20 double eagles dropped in a wood path at a foot apart. At another place, a man's arm was lying on top of the top rail of a fence, the most surprising collection of surprising sights that the eye of man ever saw. At Fairfax, the courthouse was packed full of brand new gray overcoats and the yard full of new wall tents. By the afternoon of the 22nd, General Johnston knew the extent of the rout. A year after, he would have marched until the last man was barefoot. He would have crossed the Potomac at White's Ford, have taken Washington in reverse, and by Thursday, July 25th, he would have issued his orders from the White House in Washington. Marching toward the enemy, his men would have found shoes on the wayside. They would have picked up their rations on the march. They would have found everything that was necessary. They were green troops. That was the way to season them. They were inexperienced. That was the way to give them experience. It is easy to see it now. It was almost impossible for General Johnston to have understood it then. Lee did it in September 1862, but Lee and his army had had 13 months of marching and fighting to let the general know what his troops could do and make the troops understand what they were capable of. But Lee's army, after the victory of 2nd Manassas in August 1862, when he crossed the Potomac, did not attempt to capture Washington. He had beaten McClellan on the peninsula. He had beaten Pope, John Pope, at Manassas. His troops were composed of veterans, tough campaigners of 100 combats. The sole defenders of Washington were the debris of beaten armies who had never seen a line of battle of their adversary without being driven back by it, and who had never had the inspiration of one small success. Yet Lee, in 1862, preferred having his demoralized adversary in his rear and advancing farther into the enemy's country. We now understand that the capture of Washington in July 1861 did not involve an attack on fortifications, nor the carrying of a bridge, nor the control of a navigable river. It did involve forced marches by green men, borne up by enthusiasm and capable under the excitement of the most extraordinary energy. It is easy now to see all of this. It wasn't possible to have seen and understood it on the 22nd or 23rd of July, 1861. With the experience of the generals and of their troops, officers, and men on the 22nd of July, 1861, it seems now as if they did everything that men could do according to their lights at that time, and it is fruitless now to attempt to opportune their responsibility for what was left undone. Whether President Davis ordered or advised or expected an energetic pursuit and a prompt advance, whether General Beauregard or Johnston considered themselves constrained by the presence of the commander in chief from entire liberty of action, it is bootless to inquire or to determine. General Johnston had definitely settled all such discussion by assuming the entire responsibility for all the delay and non action, and to the end of his life, continued entirely satisfied with the wisdom of his course. It may fairly be contended that if Lee in 1862, with a veteran army of victors, crowned with glory and imbued with the confidence of invincibility, could not or would not attempt to take Washington from the debris of the armies which he had been booting about Virginia for 6 months, certainly Johnston was justified in not attempting it with utterly inexperienced troops. I believe it could have been done, but no one had a right to believe so on the morning of July 22nd, 1861. The consequences of the victory were not as damaging to the defeated nor as advantageous to the victors as might have been expected. The Northern statesmen recovered from their panic in marvelous brief time and at once applied all the energy of their immense machine to support the war. To make up the loss of the Southern market to the Northern manufacturer, well, they gave him a new and better market in war expenses. To give work to unemployed labor, they paid bounties to recruits and premiums to substitutes. The vigor of a democracy was never more vividly illustrated. The enthusiasm of the people took control of the last dollar and the last man, and then sent out into the world to borrow more men and more money. The influence on the South, on the other hand, was not so invigorating. The Southern people, for several generations, had trained themselves into a vainglorious mood toward the Northern men. They believed that they were inconquerable by the North, and that the men of the North were not their physical or mental equals. The rout at Manassas seemed to justify their estimate of their value, and it was difficult to get states or societies to understand that the struggle had just begun. Manassas was considered to have demonstrated the futility of further effort to subjugate the South, and there was a sensible relaxation of the effort in the South. The Confederate Congress nor the state governments had the least appreciation of the necessity of finance to support war. They believed that supplies could be raised indefinitely by mortgaging the future, and never did understand that the power of borrowing on the one side was only created by the faith in payment, and that a debt created with no security nor provision for payment becomes at once a burden. The Confederate government could have bought the entire cotton crop for bonds. It could have transported it to Europe and created a fund of 1,000 millions in gold, which would have floated 4 times that amount of bonds, have bought arms, fleets, moral support, recognition, independence. President Davis, from the first, had the clearest ideas of the necessity of the emergency. Lee and Johnston certainly understood it as well. But the brains of the South were in the Army. Her leading men, her thinkers, and statesmen were in the field in charge of regiments or brigades. Consequently, her Congress was inferior to the Northern Congress, and from first to last, there was not a single man in the legislative department of the government who appreciated the tremendous problem before them. The Confederate States were not crushed by overwhelming resources nor overpowering numbers. They were outfought by the Northern men. The great brain of Chase, Salmon Chase, which conceived the financial system of the Union side, and the courage of Lincoln and the wisdom of Seward administered the resources of the North and supplied the machinery of currency, credit, and industry, and created by modern civilization in a way no Southern statesman was able to do. The monopoly of the currency, that machine by which trade and commerce and industry lives, was invented by Chase and seized by the federal powers and wielded with irresistible force and inexhaustible resources. Therefore, the consequences of the rout at Manassas were rather favorable to the Federals and unfavorable to the Confederates. So there you have the opinion and the learned opinion, if you will, and thoughts of a Confederate general, Bradley Johnson, of the meaning of the first battle of Manassas, not only to the two armies in the field on that July day in 1861, but all the way through the rest of the war. And his evaluation of the brains of the South being in the military and the brains of the North being in Congress and the administrative branch. Thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.